Welcome, sailor. This is the story of a young man who thought he was chasing adventure, but instead came face to face with death in one of the most unforgiving seas on Earth. What was supposed to be a chance to make quick money turned into a 5-day nightmare trapped on a sinking boat, fighting freezing waves, engine failure, and impossible choices. He wasn't ready. No one ever is.
My name is Jake Thompson, and 7 years ago, I was a 22-year-old college dropout from Portland, Oregon, desperate for work and tired of dead-end jobs that paid minimum wage and offered no future. I dropped out of Portland State University halfway through my junior year, burned through my savings, and was living in my buddy's garage, delivering pizzas and wondering what the hell I was going to do with my life. That's when I saw a posting on a maritime job board: Deckhand positions available, commercial crab fishing vessels, Dutch Harbor, Alaska, no experience necessary, $3,000 per week during season. $3,000 a week. That was more money than I'd ever dreamed of making, especially for someone with no real skills and a half-finished degree in communications. The Bering Sea promised good money, adventure, and a chance to prove myself as a man in one of the most dangerous professions in America. Commercial crab fishing has a fatality rate 26 times higher than the average American job. Every year, boats go down, men are lost, and families are destroyed by the unforgiving waters off Alaska's coast. I had no idea that my first week aboard the Northern Wind would teach me more about fear, survival, and the weight of impossible decisions than any classroom ever could. What started as a routine king crab fishing run in October 2017 became a fight for our lives when a massive storm system caught us 180 miles from the nearest coast with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. This is the story of 5 days that changed everything I thought I knew about the sea, about courage, and about the price of survival when everything goes wrong at once. It's about 5 men trapped on a sinking boat in 40-foot seas, facing choices that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It's about discovering that sometimes, when death seems certain, the only option is to find strength you never knew you had. But most of all, it's about the Northern Wind and the men who refused to let her go down without a fight. I stepped off the Alaska Airlines 737 at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport on October 15, 2017, with everything I owned crammed into a single military surplus duffel bag. The plan was simple: catch a connecting flight to Dutch Harbor, sign onto a crab boat, work my ass off for 2 months, and come home with enough money to get my life back on track. The flight to Dutch Harbor was on a Pen Air Saab 340, one of those small turboprops that gets tossed around like a toy in Alaska's notorious weather. As we descended through the clouds toward Unalaska Island, I got my first real look at the Bering Sea. Even from the air, I could see the massive swells rolling across the surface, gray water stretching to the horizon under an equally gray sky. Dutch Harbor is not a welcoming place. Built on the edge of nowhere, it exists for one purpose: to service the commercial fishing fleet that works the Bering Sea. The wind hit me like a slap when I walked off the plane, cold, salty, and relentless, carrying the smell of fish processing plants and diesel fuel. October in the Aleutians felt like winter anywhere else, and despite thinking I was prepared, I wasn't. Not even close. Captain Roy Hendricks was waiting for me at the harbor master's office, a weathered man in his 50s with hands like leather and eyes that seemed to measure everything twice. He wore a faded Carhartt jacket and wool watch cap, and when he shook my hand, his grip told me everything I needed to know about who was in charge. "You Thompson?" he asked, looking me up and down. "You look younger than your application said." "Yes, sir. Ready to work." "We'll see about that. Come on, let me show you your new home." The Northern Wind was moored at the Trident Seafoods dock, a 120-foot crab boat built in 1987 in Seattle. She wasn't pretty. 30 years of Bering Sea fishing had left her scarred and weathered, but she looked solid, functional, built to handle whatever the ocean could throw at her. Her steel hull was painted blue and white, with rust stains streaking down from every fitting and weld. The deck was crowded with crab pots, hydraulic equipment, and the massive crane they called the pot launcher. "She's not much to look at," Captain Hendricks said, watching me study the boat, "but she's brought me home from some bad weather. That's more important than pretty paint." He introduced me to the crew as we walked the deck. Tommy Vasquez was the engineer, a quiet guy from Seattle who'd been working these waters for 8 years. He was maybe 35, with calloused hands permanently stained with engine oil and a way of listening to the boat's sounds that told you he understood her mechanical soul. Marcus "Mac" McDonald was a veteran deckhand from Kodiak, 42 years old, with arms like tree trunks and a beard that had never seen a razor. He took one look at me and shook his head. "Another college boy who thinks this is going to be an adventure. Hope you can swim, kid." Carl Brennan was the other deckhand, a big Irish American from South Boston who'd been doing this work for 15 years. At 45, he was the crew's unofficial leader on deck, the guy who made sure everyone went home with all their fingers and toes. "First time?" he asked, looking at my brand new rain gear and spotless work boots. "First time commercial fishing," I admitted. "But I've been on boats before." "Base boats on some lake don't count, college boy," Max said. "This is different. This is the Bering Sea. She'll kill you just for being stupid." The northern wind left Dutch Harbor at 6 a.m. on October 16th, heading northwest toward the King Crab grounds. I stood on deck as we cleared the harbor breakwater, watching the land fall away behind us. The excitement I'd felt was quickly replaced by something else as the boat began to encounter the open ocean swells. Within an hour, I was puking over the rail. "Motion sickness," Tommy explained as I wiped my mouth with a rag. "Happens to everybody the first few times. You'll get your sea legs in a day or two." The first lesson was simple. Everything on a fishing boat is designed to hurt you. The deck is constantly wet and slippery. The machinery is powerful enough to crush bones without slowing down. The ocean wants to wash you overboard every time a wave breaks over the bow. And if you get hurt, the nearest hospital is hundreds of miles away. "First rule," Mac told me as we worked on deck that first afternoon, "the sea doesn't care about your problems, your experience, or your plans. She'll kill you just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Second rule, trust your crew because they're all that stands between you and the bottom. Commercial crab fishing is brutally simple. You drop baited pots on the ocean floor, wait for crabs to crawl inside, then haul the pots back up and sort the catch. Each pot weighs 800 pounds empty, and when it's full of crab and seawater, it can weigh close to 2,000 pounds. The hydraulic systems that move them around generate enough force to tear a man's arm off. The work starts before dawn and continues until every pot is set, which can take 18 to 20 hours. You work in rain, in snow, in seas that regularly wash over the deck. Your hands are constantly wet and cold, protected only by rubber gloves that provide minimal insulation. After the first day, my hands were raw and bleeding, but I kept my mouth shut and did the work. "You're doing better than most greenhorns," Carl told me on the second day as we secured the last string of pots. "Most college boys are crying for their mothers by now." The boat worked her way northwest, following GPS coordinates that marked productive crab grounds. We drop a string of 40 pots, mark the location with GPS and radar, then move to the next spot. Each pot had to soak for at least 24 hours before we could haul it back up to check the catch. By the third day I was starting to get my sea legs. The constant motion that had made me sick was becoming normal, and I was learning to move on deck when the boat pitched and rolled. The crew was starting to accept me, slowly, cautiously, but I could feel the change in their attitude. We were working the northwestern edge of the fishing grounds, about 180 miles from Dutch Harbor, when Captain Hendricks called us into the wheelhouse for the morning weather briefing on day 4. "Low-pressure system building to the southwest," he said, pointing to the weather facts. "But the models show it tracking north of our position. We should have another day, maybe 2, of decent fishing weather before we need to start thinking about running for port." Tommy was studying the barometric pressure readings on the boat's weather station. "Pressure's been dropping faster than the forecast predicted," he said. "And look at this sea surface temperature data. Water's warmer than normal for this time of year. That can make storms intensify faster." "We'll keep an eye on it," the captain said. "But right now we've got crab to catch." That night, as I fell into my narrow bunk exhausted, I felt proud for the first time in months. I was doing it, working one of the hardest jobs in America, earning my place among men who'd been testing themselves against the sea for decades. My hands were torn up, my back ached, and I was exhausted, but I was making it. I thought I understood what we were up against. I thought the hard part was behind me. I had no idea what was coming. I woke up at 4 a.m. on October 20th to the sound of something I'd never heard before, a deep, rhythmic groaning that seemed to come from the boat's bones. The northern wind was rolling harder than she had all week, and through the porthole in my bunk, I could see the sky had turned an ominous gray-green color that made my stomach tight with worry. The motion was different too. Instead of the steady pitch and roll I'd gotten used to, the boat was moving erratically, snapping back and forth in ways that made loose items slide across the deck. I could hear things breaking in the galley, the crash of dishes, the bang of cabinet doors slamming open and shut. In the wheelhouse, Captain Hendricks was studying the latest weather facts with a frown that made everyone nervous. The paper showed a tightly wound spiral of isobars that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. "Storm changed course overnight," he said without looking up. "Intensified faster than they predicted. We're looking at sustained winds of 60 knots, gusts to 80, and seas building to 25 feet by noon. Tommy was already suited up in foul weather gear, preparing to head to the engine room for his morning checks. "How fast is it moving?" he asked. 25 knots to the northeast. "It's going to catch us before we can make port, no matter when we leave." Mac was studying the chart, measuring distances with dividers. "If we leave now, we might make Dutch Harbor before the worst of it hits. But we'd be running into following seas for the first 50 miles. Following seas in a storm can be worse than heading into it," Carl added. "Especially if they're big enough to poop us." He was talking about pooping, when a following wave breaks over the stern and floods the deck. In big seas, it can drive a boat underwater and keep her there. The decision point: how many more pots do we have to haul? The captain asked. 18, Carl replied. "Maybe 6 hours of work if the weather holds." I could see the calculation in Captain Hendrick's eyes. 18 pots at an average of 300 pounds of crab each meant roughly $25,000 worth of catch. Against that was the risk of running for port in a building storm with a hold only 2/3 full. "We haul those pots," he decided. "But we do it fast and we do it right. Any mistakes out there could kill someone." By 8 a.m., the seas had built to 15 feet, and the wind was howling across the deck at 50 knots. Working outside had become genuinely dangerous. Every wave that broke over the bow sent hundreds of gallons of seawater cascading across the deck with enough force to knock a man down. We finished securing the last of the loose gear and prepared to start hauling the remaining pots. The work was nightmare fuel. The pot launcher, which had seemed manageable in calm weather, became a monster in the storm. 800-pound crab pots swung wildly on the end of the crane cable, threatening to crush anyone who got too close. The deck was constantly awash and the footing was treacherous. "Stay away from the rail," Carl shouted over the wind noise. "One wave takes you overboard in this and we'll never find you." That's when Tommy came up from the engine room with news that made my blood run cold. "Captain, we've got a problem. Oil pressure on the main engine is dropping. Started about 20 minutes ago and it's getting worse. Looks like we're losing oil from somewhere in the system." Captain Hendrick's face went stone still. In 30 years of fishing, he'd seen boats lost to engine failure in heavy weather. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be 6. But if that engine seizes up..." Tommy didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone on that boat knew what it meant. Without engine power, we'd be at the mercy of the storm. A 120-foot fishing boat can handle massive seas if she's got power to steer into them, to maintain headway and control her position relative to the waves. Without power, she becomes a cork, rolling helplessly in the troughs between waves until something breaks, either the boat or the men inside her. "Options?" the captain asked. "I can try to find the leak and patch it temporarily, but I'll need to shut down the engine to do it safely. With the oil pressure this low, running the engine much longer could seize it anyway. But in these seas, shutting down means we'd be dead in the water for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer." Through the wheelhouse windows, I watched waves that were now easily 20 feet high marching toward us in endless ranks. The northern wind climbed each one like climbing a mountain, paused at the crest where the wind tried to tear the wheelhouse windows out, then plunged down the backside into the trough, her propeller spinning uselessly in the air for a terrifying moment before biting water again. "If we lose power out here," Mac said quietly, "the Coast Guard can't reach us. Not in this weather. Helicopters can't fly, and the nearest cutter is 8 hours away in good conditions." Captain Hendricks was studying the charts, the weather reports, and the engine gauges with the concentration of a man whose decisions would determine whether 5 people lived or died. "We're still 6 hours from Dutch Harbor at full speed in these conditions. Tommy, how confident are you that you can find this leak and fix it?" 60%, maybe 70. "The oil system isn't that complicated and I've got spare gaskets and seals. But Captain, if I'm wrong, if there's internal damage to the engine block or the oil pump has failed." "If you're wrong, we're all dead anyway." Hendricks made the call that would haunt all of us. "Shut her down. Do what you can. But Tommy, you get 30 minutes, no more. After that, we start the engine whether it's fixed or not and take our chances." As Tommy headed below to attempt the repair, I felt the northern wind immediately begin to change her motion. The steady vibration of the main engine, which had been as constant as a heartbeat since we left port, fell silent. Without the engine's power driving us forward into the waves, we started to fall off into the trough between swells, rolling violently from side to side instead of climbing over them. The difference was immediate and terrifying. Instead of the purposeful motion of a boat under power, we began wallowing like a piece of debris, at the mercy of forces beyond our control. That's when I learned what real fear felt like, Not the quick spike of adrenaline when something dangerous happens, but the cold, sick knowledge that you might be about to die and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The moment Tommy shut down the engine, everything changed. The steady throb that had been the northern wind's heartbeat since we left port fell silent, replaced by sounds I'll never forget. The shriek of wind through the rigging, the thunder of waves breaking over the bow, and the deep, ominous groaning of the hull as she twisted and flexed under stresses she wasn't designed to handle. Without forward momentum, we were no longer climbing over the waves in a controlled manner. Instead, we wallowed in the troughs between swells, taking the full force of 30-foot seas on our beam. The boat rolled so violently that anything not bolted down became a projectile. In the galley, dishes exploded from the cupboards in crashes that sounded like gunshots. In the wheelhouse, navigation equipment tore loose from its mounts, and charts scattered across the deck. "Everyone stay inside and hang on," Captain Hendricks shouted over the noise. "Tommy's got 30 minutes to fix this or we're in serious trouble." Through the wheelhouse windows, I watched waves that now towered 30 feet above us in the troughs and 40 feet when we climbed toward the crests. When we rolled to starboard, I could see nothing but gray water stretching to the horizon, the surface torn into foam by winds that were now gusting over 70 knots. When we rolled back to port, the wave faces rose like moving walls of water, their tops blown away in horizontal sheets of spray that looked like snow. Mac, who'd seen everything in 15 years of Bering Sea fishing, was gripping the chart table with white knuckles. "I've been in some weather," he said, his voice tight, "but never dead in the water like this. If we take a big one wrong, if she rolls past her recovery point." He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. Commercial fishing boats are designed to be stable, but they have limits. Push them too far and they don't come back. They roll over and stay that way, trapping everyone inside as they sink. The 20 minutes Tommy worked below were the longest of my life up to that point. Every wave that hit us seemed bigger than the last, and the boat's motion became increasingly violent and unpredictable. We'd roll to one side, hang there for a heart-stopping moment, then snap back so hard that we'd slam into whatever we were holding onto. 23 minutes into the repair, Max spotted it first. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, pointing through the port windows. A rogue wave was building out of the chaos, not just bigger than the others but fundamentally different. While the regular storm waves were maybe 30 to 35 feet high, this one rose out of the sea like a moving mountain, its face dark green and steep as a wall. Later we'd estimate it at close to 40 feet, maybe more. "Hold on," Captain Hendricks shouted, but there was nowhere to go, nothing more we could do but grip whatever we could reach and wait for impact. The wave hit us on the port beam with the force of a freight train. The northern wind rolled so far to starboard that the wheelhouse windows went completely underwater. For 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes, we hung there in a green underwater world, suspended between floating and sinking, between life and death. Coffee mugs, charts, navigation instruments, and loose equipment slid across the wheelhouse floor in a cascade of debris. I found myself hanging from a handrail, my feet completely off the deck, waiting to see if we'd roll back or keep going over. The angle was so steep that I could see the sea surface through the starboard windows above my head. Slowly, agonizingly, the boat began to right herself. But as she came back up, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. The sharp, splintering crack of something structural giving way, followed by the screech of tearing metal. "Carl," Captain Hendricks shouted as soon as we were upright again. "Check the port rail and the pot launcher." That sounded like something major let go. Carl struggled to the port door, fought it open against the wind that tried to tear it from his hands, and peered out into the storm. When he came back in 30 seconds later, his face was pale under his rain hood. "Captain, we lost about 20 feet of port rail and the pot launcher is twisted, looks like the hydraulic cylinder snapped. But that's not the worst part." "What is it?" "I can see into the engine room through the rear access hatch. There's water down there, Captain. A lot more water than there should be." That's when we heard Tommy's voice over the intercom, barely audible over the storm noise and made tinny by the old speakers. "Captain, I found the oil leak and got it patched temporarily. The oil pump coupling was loose, simple fix. But we've got a much bigger problem down here. That last big wave, when she rolled so far over, it opened up a seam in the hull plating on the port side. We're taking on water faster than the bilge pumps can handle." In that moment, I understood that everything we'd feared, losing power, structural damage, taking on water, had just happened at once. We were 180 miles from the nearest help, in seas that were still building, with a damaged boat that was slowly sinking. And according to the latest weather report crackling over the radio, the storm was still intensifying. Tommy got the main engine restarted, and for about 30 seconds we celebrated. The familiar vibration returned, the boat responded to the helm, and it felt like we might have dodged the bullet. But our relief was short-lived. The northern wind was riding lower in the water, her movements sluggish and wrong in ways that experienced fishermen recognize immediately. Every wave that broke over the bow stayed on deck longer, pooling in areas where water should have drained away through the scuppers. The boat's motion had changed from the sharp, responsive movement of a healthy vessel to something heavier, more labored. "How bad is the flooding, Tommy?" Captain Hendricks asked over the intercom. "Bad, Captain. Real bad." Tommy's voice crackled back through speakers that were starting to sound waterlogged. The seam opened up about 3 feet along the port side, maybe 4 feet below the waterline. "I got some emergency patches on it, wooden plugs, hydraulic cement, and a piece of steel plate held in place with come-alongs, but they're temporary at best. Water's still coming in, just slower now." "How much slower?" "Instead of maybe 2 hours before she goes down, we might have 4 or 5. "But Captain, if we take another big wave like that last one, if those patches fail?" Mac was already suiting up in his survival gear, the bright orange immersion suit that commercial fishermen call a Gumby suit. "I'll go help him with the pumps," he said. "Negative," Captain Hendricks said firmly. "Nobody goes below unless I say so. If we have to abandon ship, I need everyone topside and ready to move fast." Those words, "abandon ship," hit me like a physical blow. I'd seen enough movies and documentaries to know what that meant in seas like this. The northern wind carried a 6-man life raft, but launching it in 40-foot waves, getting everyone aboard alive, and surviving until rescue arrived would require a combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention that most men never receive. "How long do we have?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Depends on whether Tommy's patches hold, whether the storm gets worse, and whether we take any more big waves broadside," Captain Hendricks replied. "Could be an hour, could be 6. But we're not going down without a fight." For the next 2 hours, we fought for every mile toward Dutch Harbor. The engine ran, but we couldn't push her hard with water sloshing in the bilge and the hull compromised. Captain Hendricks had to balance speed against stability, go too fast, and the stress on the damaged hull could make the flooding worse. Go too slow, and we might not reach port before the boat sank. Every few minutes, a larger wave would break over the bow, adding hundreds more gallons to our load. The boat's motion became increasingly unpredictable, sometimes sluggish and wallowing, sometimes snapping back and forth in ways that made our teeth rattle and threw us against the wheelhouse bulkheads. Tommy worked below like a man possessed, constantly adjusting the bilge pumps, reinforcing patches, monitoring the hull breach. The engine room had become a partially flooded hell of diesel fumes, seawater, and machinery that could kill him if he made one wrong move. But he stayed down there because he knew that if those pumps failed, if those patches gave way, we were all dead. Mac and Carl took turns checking emergency equipment and preparing for the possibility that we'd have to abandon ship. They inventoried the survival suits, checked the life raft, and gathered emergency supplies: flares, emergency beacon, fresh water, and anything else that might help us survive in the North Pacific until help arrived. That's when Captain Hendricks pulled me aside to have a conversation that still haunts me. "Jake, I need you to understand something. We're in trouble, real trouble. This boat might not make it to port, and if she doesn't, that life raft is our only chance. But launching a raft in seas like this, getting everyone aboard, surviving until the Coast Guard can reach us." He paused, studying my face with eyes that had seen too much in 30 years at sea. "Some of us might not make it. The older guys, or anyone who gets hurt during the launch, or if we can't get everyone into the raft before it blows away. You're young, strong, and you're learning fast. If it comes to that, if we have to abandon ship and not everyone makes it into the raft, your job is to survive and tell people what happened here." The weight of what he was saying hit me like another rogue wave. He wasn't just talking about abandoning ship. He was talking about the possibility that we might have to abandon some of the crew. About making choices that would haunt whoever survived for the rest of their lives. "Captain, we're all getting out of this," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But if we don't all make it, I need to know that someone will remember what Tommy did down there, keeping us afloat when any sane man would have given up. What Mac and Carl did, staying calm and doing their jobs when everything went to hell. These are good men, Jake. If they don't make it home, their families deserve to know they died fighting, not that they just disappeared somewhere in the Bering Sea." The responsibility he was placing on me felt heavier than the water flooding our hull. I was 22 years old, barely a week into my first real job, and this man was asking me to carry the memory of heroes if they didn't survive. At 2 p.m., Captain Hendricks made the radio call that every fisherman dreads having to make. Coast Guard Kodiak, this is fishing vessel Northern Wind. We are taking on water and in distress. Our position is. He read off our GPS coordinates. We have 5 souls on board and are attempting to make Dutch Harbor, but we may need assistance. The response came back immediately. Fishing vessel Northern Wind, this is Coast Guard Kodiak. We copy your distress call. What is the nature of your emergency? We suffered hull damage in heavy weather and are taking on water. Bilge pumps are running, but we're riding lower. Seas are 30 to 40 feet, winds gusting to 80 knots. We have survival suits and life raft aboard. Northern Wind, we are launching assets to assist. Be advised that current weather conditions prevent helicopter operations. We have a cutter en route to your position, ETA approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. It might as well have been 6 days. In 6 hours, we'd either be safely tied up at the dock in Dutch Harbor, or we'd be floating in survival suits in 40-degree water, waiting for rescue that might arrive too late. At 3:15 p.m., Tommy's voice came over the intercom with the news we'd been dreading. Captain, the patches are starting to fail. The wooden plugs are holding, but the steel plate is working loose. Water's coming in faster than we can pump it out. At this rate, we've got maybe an hour and a half before she won't stay up anymore. Through the wheelhouse windows, I could see Dutch Harbor's navigation lights in the distance, still 15 miles away. 15 miles that might as well have been 1,500. At our current speed, fighting heavy seas with a flooding boat, we needed at least 2 hours to reach port. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The boat was sinking faster than we could reach safety. Tommy, can you reinforce those patches? Buy us more time? The captain asked. I'm trying, Captain, but I'm running out of materials and options. Every time we take a big wave, the hull flexes and the patches work looser. It's like trying to plug a hole in a balloon while someone's squeezing it. Mac looked up from the life raft preparations. Captain, maybe it's time to consider launching the raft while we can still do it safely. If we wait until she's going down. We don't abandon ship while she's still floating and making way, Hendricks said firmly. But everyone get your survival suits on. We have to go, we go fast. Putting on an immersion suit in a rolling, flooding boat is harder than it sounds. The suits are designed to keep you alive in freezing water, but they're bulky, awkward, and difficult to move in. The process involves stepping into what's essentially a waterproof sleeping bag with arms and legs, then sealing yourself in with heavy-duty zippers and Velcro closures. Make sure the suit fits properly, Carl instructed as we helped each other into the gear. Too loose and water gets in. Too tight and you can't move. And whatever you do, don't inflate the life preserver until you're in the water. If you inflate it on deck and go overboard, it'll trap you underwater. As I sealed myself into the orange neoprene suit, I felt a strange combination of security and claustrophobia. The suit would keep me alive in the water, but it also meant we were acknowledging that we might end up there. At 4 p.m., with Dutch Harbor's lights clearly visible but still 12 miles away, the boat suddenly lurched to port and stayed there, listing at an angle that made walking across the wheelhouse floor impossible without holding onto something. That's it, Tommy's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted by water that was now reaching the speaker systems. The main patch just let go completely. She's flooding fast now. We've got maybe 15-20 minutes before she won't support us anymore. Captain Hendricks keyed the radio mic. Coast Guard Kodiak, this is Northern Wind. We are abandoning ship. I say again, we are abandoning ship. 5 souls entering life raft at this time. Northern Wind, we copy. Cutter is still 4 hours from your position. Emergency beacon signal received and tracking. Good luck. Launch the raft, Captain Hendricks ordered. And with those 3 words, everything I thought I knew about survival, about courage, and about what men are capable of when everything goes wrong, was about to change forever. What followed was controlled chaos executed by men who had trained for this moment but hoped they'd never need to use that training. Mac and Carl fought to deploy the life raft in 40-foot seas while Tommy and I gathered emergency supplies and Captain Hendricks transmitted our final position to the Coast Guard. The life raft was stored in a fiberglass canister bolted to the deck behind the wheelhouse. When Mac pulled the manual release, the canister split open and the raft began inflating automatically as soon as it hit the water. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the wind might blow it away before we could board, but the raft's sea anchor deployed and held it alongside the sinking Northern Wind. Jake, you go first, Captain Hendricks ordered. You're the lightest and the most agile. Get in the raft and help the others aboard. The transfer from the boat to the raft required timing each move with the waves. When the Northern Wind dropped into a trough, the raft would be level with the deck. When we rose on a wave crest, the raft could be 10 feet below us. Miss the timing and you'd either fall into the ocean or land hard enough to break bones. I waited for the right moment, then jumped. The landing was hard. I hit the rubber floor of the raft and bounced, but I was inside. The raft was maybe 8 feet in diameter, dome-shaped, with a canopy that could be closed to protect against weather. In 40-foot seas, it rode like a cork, shooting up wave faces and sliding down the backs in a motion that made the boat's movement seem gentle by comparison. Carl came next, timing his jump perfectly and landing beside me in the raft. Then Mac, who had to fight his way through the raft's entrance against wind that was trying to tear the canopy away. Tommy took longer. He'd stayed below until the last possible moment, trying to keep the pumps running and give us every extra minute he could. When Tommy finally emerged from below, he was soaked with seawater and diesel fuel, his face grim. "She's going fast now," he shouted over the wind. "Maybe 5 minutes before she rolls." His jump into the raft was the most terrifying yet. As he leaped, a massive wave caught the northern wind and lifted her up, making Tommy fall farther than expected. He hit the edge of the raft hard, and for a moment I thought we'd lost him. Carl and I grabbed his arms and hauled him inside just as another wave tried to wash him away. Captain Hendricks went last, as maritime tradition demanded. As master of the vessel, he was responsible for ensuring everyone else got off safely before saving himself. But getting the captain into the raft nearly killed us all. He waited too long. By the time he jumped, the northern wind was listing so severely to port that the jump was almost impossible. When he finally leaped, a massive wave caught both the boat and the raft, and he landed in the water between them. For a terrifying moment, I thought we'd watched our captain drown. The weight of his survival suit and the chaotic water made it impossible for him to swim. Carl and Mac grabbed the recovery lines and hauled him toward the raft while Tommy and I fought to keep the entrance open against waves that were trying to collapse the canopy. We got him aboard just as the northern wind began her final roll. She went over slowly at first, then faster, her superstructure disappearing beneath the gray water. The boat that had been our home, our protection, our only connection to the world, slipped beneath the surface like she was tired of fighting. In 30 seconds she was gone, leaving only debris floating on the surface and 5 men in an 8-foot life raft in the middle of the worst storm any of us had ever seen. The life raft in 40-foot seas was like being inside a washing machine filled with ice water. We'd shoot up the face of a wave until we were 40 feet above the surrounding water, pause for a heart-stopping moment at the crest, then slide down the backside so fast that our stomachs dropped and we went momentarily weightless. Every few minutes, a wave would break over us, filling the raft with seawater that we had to bail out with whatever containers we could find. The emergency kit included a small pump, but it couldn't keep up with the water coming in. We took turns bailing using empty water jugs, a small bucket, and even our survival suit boots. The cold was our biggest immediate enemy. Despite the survival suits, we were all soaking wet from the transfer and the constant waves breaking over the raft. The water temperature was 38 degrees, and the air wasn't much warmer. Hypothermia could kill us long before rescue arrived. "Everyone stay close together," Captain Hendricks ordered. "Share body heat. Move your hands and feet constantly to keep circulation going. And whatever happens, stay awake. Falling asleep in this cold means you don't wake up." The storm raged for 18 hours. 18 hours of being tossed around like a toy, constantly cold and wet, fighting to stay inside the raft as waves tried to tear it apart. The canopy kept most of the water out, but it also made the interior dark and claustrophobic. We couldn't see what was coming, couldn't prepare for the next wave that would lift us up or slam us down. Tommy developed hypothermia first. Despite our best efforts to keep him warm, he began shivering uncontrollably, then became confused and lethargic. In the dim light of the emergency flashlight, his lips were blue and he was having trouble speaking coherently. "We need to get him warmer," Carl said, pulling Tommy against his chest and wrapping both of them in the emergency sleeping bag from the survival kit. "If his core temperature drops much more, he's in real trouble." Mac wasn't doing much better. The veteran deckhand had taken the worst of the impact when we were trying to get Captain Hendricks aboard, and we suspected he'd broken ribs. Every breath was painful and he couldn't help with the bailing. But he never complained, never asked for special treatment. "Been hurt worse than this," he said through gritted teeth. "Just need to make it until morning." To keep ourselves awake and maintain morale, we told stories. Captain Hendricks talked about his 30 years fishing, about storms he'd survived and boats he'd brought home against impossible odds. Carl shared stories from his 15 years on the Bering Sea, about close calls and good fishing and the brotherhood of men who choose to make their living from the most dangerous waters in the world. Tommy, when he was lucid enough to speak, talked about his family in Seattle, his wife Maria and their 2 young daughters. "I promised Maria this would be my last season," he said, his voice weak but determined. "She wants me to find work on shore. After this, I think she's right." Mac told us about his father, who'd been a fisherman before him, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of MacDonald men who fished these waters, he said. None of us ever went down. Not about to start now. I talked about my life in Portland, about dropping out of college and feeling like a failure, about how this job was supposed to be my chance to prove myself. "Guess I'm getting more of an education than I bargained for," I said, trying to make light of our situation. But beneath the stories and the forced humor, we all knew the truth. We were 5 men floating in a life raft in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, with no guarantee that rescue would arrive before exposure or the storm killed us. Our only connection to the outside world was the emergency position indicating radio beacon, APERB, that automatically transmitted our location to rescue services. The small device, no bigger than a handheld radio, was literally our lifeline. As long as it kept transmitting, the Coast Guard would know where we were. "How long does the battery last?" I asked Captain Hendricks. 48 hours minimum, maybe more. But in weather like this, with the antenna getting dunked every few minutes, it might not be transmitting clearly. The thought that our rescue beacon might be failing, that we could be drifting undetected in the vast expanse of the North Pacific, was almost too terrifying to consider. Without that signal, we were 5 men in an 8-foot raft in an ocean that covers 64 million square miles. Dawn came slowly, revealing a seascape that belonged in a nightmare. Waves still towered 30 feet above us, their faces dark green and menacing. The wind had dropped to maybe 50 knots, but that was still strong enough to tear the tops off waves and send spray across the water like horizontal snow. In the gray morning light, we could see how much the night had cost us. Tommy's condition had worsened. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Mac was clearly in severe pain, holding his side and unable to move without grimacing. Carl had developed frostbite on 2 fingers, the tips white and numb despite his insulated gloves. Captain Hendricks and I were in the best shape, but even we were showing signs of exposure and exhaustion. None of us had slept, and we'd been fighting the cold and the motion for over 12 hours. "How much longer?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Coast Guard said they had a cutter en route, but that was before we abandoned ship. In weather like this, even a Coast Guard vessel has to be careful. They can't risk their crew to save ours unless conditions improve. The waiting was the hardest part. We'd done everything we could, activated the beacon, deployed the sea anchor, conserved our energy and supplies. Now all we could do was stay alive and hope that help would arrive before our bodies gave out. At 10 a.m., Max spotted something that made our hearts race. "Boat? There's a boat." About 2 miles away, barely visible through the spray and waves, we could see what looked like a vessel heading in our direction. We broke out the emergency flares, firing 2 of our precious 6 signals into the gray sky. "They see us," Carl shouted. "They're turning this way." For 20 minutes, we watched the boat approach, our hopes rising with each passing minute. Rescue was coming. We were going to make it. But as the vessel got closer, something was wrong. It wasn't a Coast Guard cutter or a fishing boat coming to help. It was another commercial vessel, and it was in trouble too. Through the spray we could see that it was listing badly to one side, clearly taking on water. "Jesus," Captain Hendricks whispered. "They're in worse shape than we were." We watched in horror as the other boat rolled over and sank, taking whatever crew it had carried down with it. There were no life rafts, no survivors, no other vessels in the area. The boat that we'd thought was our salvation had become another tragedy, another reminder of how easily the sea could kill. The psychological impact was devastating. For a brief moment we believed we were saved. Now we were back to the reality of our situation. 5 men in a life raft, alone in an ocean that had just claimed another vessel. "Don't think about it," Captain Hendricks said, seeing the despair on our faces. "Focus on staying alive. The Coast Guard is coming. We just have to hang on." But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt that was eating at all of us. How many other boats were out there in trouble? How many rescues was the Coast Guard trying to coordinate? And how long could 5 men survive in a life raft before exposure and hypothermia finished what the storm had started? At 2:30 p.m., nearly 20 hours after we'd abandoned the northern wind, we heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the deep throb of helicopter rotors cutting through the wind noise. "There!" Carl shouted, pointing through the raft's small observation window. "Coast Guard helicopter." The orange and white Jayhawk helicopter appeared out of the gray sky like an angel, fighting against winds that were still gusting to 60 knots. But even as relief flooded through us, I could see the challenge the rescue crew faced. In 40-foot seas with high winds, a helicopter rescue is extremely dangerous for both the survivors and the rescue team. The helicopter made several passes overhead, the crew assessing the conditions and planning their approach. Through the aircraft's windows, I could see the rescue swimmer preparing his equipment, a man who was about to risk his life to save ours. Captain Hendricks activated our handheld radio, establishing contact with the helicopter crew. Coast Guard Rescue, this is Life Raft with 5 survivors from the fishing vessel Northern Wind. We have 1 man in serious condition from hypothermia, 1 with possible broken ribs. All are conscious but showing signs of exposure. Roger, Life Raft. We see you. Due to sea conditions, we're going to deploy our rescue swimmer. Prepare to receive rescue personnel. What happened next was a display of courage that still takes my breath away. The Coast Guard rescue swimmer, a young petty officer named Dave Martinez, jumped from the helicopter into 40-foot seas, trusting his equipment and training to keep him alive in conditions that had already sunk 2 boats. He landed in the water about 50 yards from our raft, immediately deployed his fins and began swimming toward us. Fighting against waves that could have easily killed him, he reached our raft and grabbed the safety line. "How many injuries?" he shouted over the wind noise as he pulled himself partially into the raft. "Hypothermia, possible broken ribs, frostbite," Captain Hendricks replied. "But we're all conscious and mobile. We're going to take you up one at a time. Worst injury first." Tommy went first, unconscious now and barely breathing. Martinez fitted him with a rescue harness and signaled the helicopter. The basket came down, bouncing wildly in the wind, and Martinez managed to get Tommy secured inside. We watched our shipmate disappear into the helicopter, not knowing if we'd ever see him alive again. Mac went next, gritting his teeth as Martinez helped him into the harness despite his broken ribs. Then Carl, then me. Each transfer was a battle against the wind and waves, requiring perfect timing and nerves of steel from the helicopter crew. Captain Hendricks went last, as was his tradition. As the senior officer, he ensured all his crew were safe before accepting rescue himself. When the basket finally lifted him from the raft, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. We were saved, but the Northern Wind was gone forever, along with our catch, our gear, and our confidence that the sea couldn't kill us. The flight to Dutch Harbor took 30 minutes that felt like 30 seconds. Inside the helicopter's warm cabin, wrapped in blankets and receiving medical attention from the crew, the full impact of what we'd survived began to hit me. Tommy was unconscious, his core body temperature dangerously low. The flight medic was working to stabilize him, monitoring his vital signs and preparing him for immediate transfer to the island's medical clinic. Mac was conscious but in severe pain, his breathing shallow and labored. Carl's frostbitten fingers were already showing signs of tissue damage that would require treatment to prevent infection and possible amputation. At the clinic in Dutch Harbor, we were treated for hypothermia, exposure, and our various injuries. Tommy spent 3 days in intensive care, his body slowly warming and his vital signs gradually stabilizing. Mac had 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung that required surgery. Carl lost 2 fingertips to frostbite but kept the rest of his hand. Captain Hendricks and I were the luckiest, treated for mild hypothermia and exposure, then released after 24 hours of observation. The Coast Guard conducted a thorough investigation into the loss of the Northern Wind. Their report concluded that the vessel was seaworthy and properly equipped, that the crew followed correct procedures, and that the sinking resulted from structural damage caused by extreme weather conditions beyond the normal operating parameters of the vessel. In other words, we'd done everything right and the sea had tried to kill us anyway. The insurance settlement covered the boat's value but couldn't replace the sense of security that comes from believing you can handle whatever the ocean throws at you. Captain Hendricks used his portion to buy a small house in Kodiak and never went to sea again. 30 years is enough, he told me before I left Alaska. The sea let me go this time, but she might not be so generous next time. I flew back to Portland 3 weeks later, carrying more money than I'd ever seen but feeling like I'd lost something that I couldn't name. The confidence I'd gained during my first few days aboard the Northern Wind had been replaced by a deep respect for forces beyond human control and an understanding of how quickly everything can change. My parents didn't understand why I looked different, why I didn't talk much about my adventure in Alaska. How could I explain that I'd watched good men nearly die, that I'd spent 18 hours believing I was going to die myself, that I'd learned the difference between the kind of courage you see in movies and the real thing? The 5 of us stayed in touch after the rescue. Tommy recovered fully and took a job as a diesel mechanic in Seattle. keeping his promise to his wife never to fish again. Mac returned to the Bering Sea the following season, his ribs healed but his confidence shaken. He lasted 2 more years before moving to Kodiak to work in a fish processing plant. Carl kept fishing for another 5 years, but the frostbite damage to his hands eventually forced him to retire. He opened a small tackle shop in Dutch Harbor, where he tells stories to tourists about the old days when fishing was more dangerous and men were tougher. Captain Hendricks died of a heart attack in 2021, 4 years after our rescue. At his funeral in Kodiak, half the commercial fishing fleet in Alaska showed up to pay their respects to a man who'd brought crews home safely for 3 decades before the sea finally took his boat. 7 years later, I still work on boats, though I never went back to the Bering Sea. I found work on research vessels based out of Newport, Oregon. Less money than commercial fishing, but safer waters and better weather. The work suits me, and I've learned to appreciate the difference between adventure and survival. I learned something in that life raft that no classroom could teach, something that has shaped every decision I've made since. Survival isn't about individual strength or courage or determination, though all of those matter. It's about refusing to give up on the people beside you, even when everything logical says you should save yourself. The sea doesn't care about your plans, your experience, or your fears. It doesn't care if you're a 22-year-old college dropout or a 50-year-old veteran captain. It will kill you just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or it will let you live for reasons you'll never understand. But the sea also doesn't care about your limits. Sometimes, when everything goes wrong at once, when death seems certain and hope seems foolish, the only choice is to discover that you're capable of more than you ever imagined. Not because you're special, but because the men beside you need you to be. The northern wind lies somewhere on the bottom of the Bering Sea, another casualty of waters that have claimed thousands of vessels over the decades. She's marked on no chart, visited by no divers, mourned by no one except the 5 men who lived to tell her story. But that story matters. It matters because Tommy Vasquez risked his life to keep her afloat when any reasonable man would have given up. It matters because Mac McDonald and Carl Brennan did their jobs with broken bones and frostbitten hands. It matters because Captain Roy Hendricks made the hardest decisions a man can make and lived with the consequences. It matters because sometimes, when the worst happens, ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. Not because they're heroes, but because heroes are just ordinary people who refuse to quit when quitting makes sense. The Bering Sea is still there, still dangerous, still claiming boats and lives every season. The men and women who work those waters know the risks, accept them as part of the job, and go to sea anyway because someone has to harvest the food that feeds the world. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics and Coast Guard reports, but as human beings who chose to test themselves against the most unforgiving environment on Earth. Some of them come home with stories. Some of them don't come home at all. This is the story of 5 who came home and the boat that didn't. If you're watching this and thinking about a career in commercial fishing, understand what you're getting into. The money is real, but so is the danger. The adventure is real, but so is the possibility that you might not come home. The brotherhood is real, but so is the weight of watching good people die doing a job that someone has to do. If you do decide to go, listen to the old-timers. Learn from men like Captain Hendricks and Tommy Vasquez and Mac McDonald. Respect the sea, but don't fear it. Prepare for the worst, but don't expect it. And remember that the difference between a story of survival and a Coast Guard casualty report often comes down to split-second decisions made by exhausted people in impossible conditions. The northern wind taught me that the sea doesn't owe you anything. Not safety, not mercy, not a second chance. But it also taught me that sometimes, when you refuse to give up on the people who matter, when you do your job regardless of the cost, when you choose courage over comfort, the sea will let you live to tell the story. And that's a lesson worth learning whether you ever set foot on a boat or not.